Before I read this one, I want to say something. I get a lot of submissions. Most of them are good, some of them are great. Every now and then one comes through that sits with me for days before I can figure out how to introduce it. This is one of those. The person who sent this asked me not to use their real name. They said they found out what happened to Daniel through his daughter, who is now an adult, and who gave permission for this story to be told on the condition that her father's full name not be used. I'm going to honor that. What you're about to hear is as close to the truth as anyone still living could piece together. Let's get into it. Daniel Reyes was 34 years old and smarter than his life suggested. That's not a criticism, that's just the specific kind of wrong that accumulates quietly in a man who reads 3 books a month, speaks 2 languages, and spends his days counting inventory in a distribution warehouse outside Fresno, California. Fresno. If you've never been, picture a city that the rest of California forgot to include in its mythology. Flat, hot, a place where summer lasts too long and ambition tends to dry out before it gets anywhere. Daniel had lived there his whole life. He didn't hate it, he just felt most days like he was standing in a waiting room and no one had ever called his name. He had a daughter, Maya, 7 years old, every other weekend, bright enough to scare him with how much she noticed. He had a studio apartment, a 12-year-old Honda, and a library card he used more than anything else he owned. He had been divorced for 2 years. The divorce was mutual and miserable, and neither of them had been wrong about the other, which somehow made it worse. He was not a desperate man. That's important. He was a patient man who had run out of patience without quite realizing it. The change started with a coworker named Brett, who was not a smart man, but was the kind of man who talked constantly, which sometimes amounts to the same thing in terms of information delivered. Brett mentioned during a shift that his neighbor had turned his life around. Not diet and exercise turned it around. Not new job turned it around. Completely turned it around. House, business. His sick kid got better. His marriage got better. Everything in the span of about 18 months, 15 years ago, went from nothing to something real. Daniel asked the neighbor's name. Brett said Omar Khalil, said he lived over on Shields Avenue in a house with a lemon tree in the front yard. Daniel said that's interesting and went back to work. He thought about it for 6 days before he drove to Shields Avenue. Omar Khalil was 61 years old and looked like a man who had been given everything he wanted and then spent 15 years being quietly afraid of it. He was Lebanese American, had come to Fresno in his 20s, had spent his 30s struggling, and had spent his 50s comfortable in a way that seemed to make him nervous rather than grateful. He had a good house, a small importing business that ran itself, a wife who was healthy. He attended mosque on Fridays and sat in the back and left quickly. When Daniel knocked on his door on a Tuesday evening, Omar looked at him for a long moment before saying anything. Then he said, "Who sent you?" Not a question, a door closing. Daniel told him about Brett, about what Brett had said, about the 18 months and the turnaround and the way Brett described it like it was impossible. Omar said Brett talked too much and started to close the door. Daniel put his hand on the frame, not aggressive, just present. He said, "I have a daughter. I see her 4 days a month. I am 34 years old and I have been waiting my whole life for something to change and nothing changes. I'm not here to take anything from you. I just need to know if what Brett said is true." Omar looked at him for a long time. Then he stepped back from the door. They sat in Omar's kitchen. Omar made coffee without asking if Daniel wanted any. Strong cardamom, the smell of it filling the room in a way that felt like a different country. Omar was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "There are things in this world that are older than us, older than religion, though religion knows about them, older than history, though history has their names in it. In Arabic, we call them jinn. You know this word?" Daniel said yes. Omar said, "What you think you know is wrong. Forget the lamp, forget the cartoon. What they are is—" He stopped, drank his coffee. "They are made of smokeless fire. That is the old description, and it is more accurate than it sounds. They exist alongside us. Most of them want nothing to do with us. Some of them can be compelled through specific means, specific materials, specific words, a specific structure of invitation that is more like a contract than a prayer. If it is done correctly, one will come, and it will grant what you ask. That part is real. I am the proof of that." Daniel asked how. Omar told him about the book, an old text, not commercially available, that had been passed to him by an uncle who had gotten it from someone else, and so on back through a chain of people who had all wanted something badly enough to look for it. The incense, the circle drawn in a specific way, the names spoken in a specific order, the time, always between 2 and 3 in the morning, always a night, with no moon visible. Daniel asked him to write it down. Omar said no. Daniel asked again. Omar said no again. This went on. Daniel was not aggressive. He was simply immovable. He sat in that kitchen for 2 hours, and he asked, and Omar refused, and eventually something in Omar shifted. The way things shift in people who have been carrying guilt long enough that sharing it starts to feel like the only available relief. Omar wrote it down, all of it. The incense, oud and black seed burned together. The circle, drawn in salt, specific dimensions, specific symbols at each cardinal point. The names, 7 of them, in Arabic, spoken slowly, once each. The moon condition, the time window. He handed Daniel the paper. Then he said, "There is one more thing." Daniel waited. Omar looked at the paper in Daniel's hand and then looked away. He said, "Be careful what you ask for." And that was all he said. He did not tell Daniel about the binding seal, the symbol that established dominion, the piece of the ritual that told the jinn who was master and who was servant, the single most important component of the entire process. Later, Daniel would understand why Omar left it out. Omar wasn't trying to hurt him. Omar had used the seal himself, and it had cost him something he had never told his wife about, and never would. He thought an incomplete ritual wouldn't work. He thought he was protecting Daniel by omitting it. He was wrong about that, and he would spend the rest of his life knowing it. Daniel went home. He read the paper 40 times over 3 days. He researched everything on it. The names, the symbolism, the tradition it was drawing from. He was thorough. He was careful. He filled in what he could from what he found. Where the binding seal should have been, there was a gap in his understanding that he didn't know was a gap. He made a judgment call. He drew something that seemed to fit based on what he'd read. A Solomon's seal variant. It looked right. It was in the right place in the circle. It was wrong in a way he had no way of knowing. On a moonless Thursday in late September at 2:15 in the morning, Daniel Reyes burned oud and black seed in his studio apartment, drew a salt circle on his kitchen floor, spoke 7 names out loud in the dark, and waited. The first thing was the smell. Ozone. Sharp and electric, like the air before a lightning strike. Then something under it. Copper. Faint, like a coin held in a warm hand. Then the pressure changed, not dramatically, just the room felt occupied in a way it hadn't a moment before. The voice came from inside his head, not his ears, his skull, as though something had placed a hand on either side of his head and spoken directly into the bone. It said, in English that was perfectly clear and carried an accent from no country Daniel could place. "You have called. I have come. You may ask 3 things. Choose carefully. I will not remind you of this again." Daniel's hands were shaking. He had prepared for this, and he was still not prepared for this. He asked, "What are you?" The voice said, "Older than your city." older than your country, older than the religion that named me. That is sufficient." Daniel steadied himself. He made his first wish. He asked for financial security. Not greed, he was specific, almost cautious about it. Enough to quit the warehouse, pay off his debts, put money away for Maya's future. He said $200,000. The voice said, "Done." The pressure in the room didn't change. Nothing visible happened. Daniel sat in the salt circle until 4 a.m. and then went to bed feeling like a man who had either changed his life or lost his mind. At 7:43 the next morning, his phone rang. It was his aunt. His mother had died in her sleep, peacefully, they said. No pain, they said. And then, 2 days later, a call from a lawyer Daniel had never heard of about a life insurance policy his mother had taken out in 1987 and never mentioned to anyone. $212,000. Daniel sat in his car in the parking lot of the funeral home and did not move for a long time. He had not wished for his mother to die. He had not specified a source. He had simply asked for a number, and the universe, or whatever was now living in the corner of his apartment, had found the most direct available path. He stood at her grave 3 days later and understood for the first time what Omar's face had looked like when he opened his door. He should have stopped. Every rational part of him knew that. He had 2 wishes left and a feeling in his apartment at night like standing in a room with something that was pretending not to watch you. He made his second wish 4 weeks later. He wished for his ex-wife back. Her name was Christina. He missed her in the specific way you miss someone you chose wrong with for reasons that were right. Loved the wrong version of each other, right people, wrong time, something like that. Maya missed her mother being around more. That's what he told himself, that it was for Maya. He made the wish on a Tuesday night. Wednesday morning, Christina texted him, out of nowhere, said she'd been thinking about him, asked if they could talk. She moved back in 6 weeks later, warm, present, affectionate in ways she hadn't been in the last years of their marriage. She was good with Maya. She laughed easily. She seemed happy in a way that was unqualified and constant, and after 3 weeks of it, Daniel sat across from her at dinner one evening and said the name of her sister. Christina smiled at him and she said, "Who?" Daniel felt the floor shift. He spent the next week testing it carefully so she wouldn't notice. Names, places, shared memories, her college roommate, her childhood dog, her grandmother who had died when she was 17 and who she used to cry about every year on the anniversary. Gone, all of it. The person sitting across from him knew Daniel's name and Maya's name and the layout of the apartment and how he took his coffee. Everything before the Wednesday morning text simply did not exist for her. Daniel started sleeping on the couch. The thing that was wearing Christina's face noticed. It tilted its head at him sometimes. It smiled anyway. He called Omar on a Friday night, voice low so Christina, so it wouldn't hear from the other room. Omar answered on the second ring like he'd been waiting. Daniel told him what happened. Both wishes. His mother, Christina. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Daniel checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Omar said, "The binding seal." "I didn't tell you about the binding seal." Daniel asked what that was. Omar told him, the symbol that established control, the piece that told the jinn the human was master. Without it, the jinn was not bound to serve. It was simply responding, fulfilling the literal request. No obligation to protect the wisher from the result. No constraint on method. Daniel asked why he hadn't told him. Omar said, "Because I was ashamed of what mine cost me, and I thought without the seal the ritual wouldn't complete. I thought you'd be safe." Daniel said, "I have one wish left." Omar said, "Don't use it." Daniel said, "Can I use it to undo this?" Long silence. Omar said, "You cannot wish away a jinn you don't control. Without the seal you never had control. The third wish won't bind it, it will feed it. Daniel asked what the seal did now, if it was too late to use it. Omar was quiet for a moment that felt like a door being considered. Then he said, "It closes the door, even now, but—" He stopped. Daniel said, "But what?" Omar said, "The door closes from the outside. Whoever reads the seal, they're on the inside when it locks." Omar drove to Fresno the next morning. He walked into Daniel's apartment and stopped in the hallway. The temperature was wrong. A smell Daniel had stopped noticing. Copper and ozone, permanent now, baked into the walls. The thing in the kitchen that had Christina's face turned and smiled at him. Omar did not smile back. In the bedroom with the door closed, he wrote the seal on a piece of paper and held it out to Daniel. He said, "I'll do it. This is my fault." Daniel looked at the paper. He thought about Maya, 7 years old, every other weekend, bright enough to scare him. He thought about what this thing was getting stronger toward, what it would eventually reach if the door stayed open. He took the paper from Omar's hand. Omar said, "Daniel." Daniel said, "Does she come back if I close it? Does Christina come back?" Omar said he didn't know. He thought so. He hoped so. Daniel nodded. He asked Omar to leave the apartment. Omar refused. Daniel asked again. Something in the way he asked it made Omar go. Daniel sat in the kitchen for a while. The thing across from him smiled. The salt circle was still faintly visible on the floor from weeks ago. He picked up his phone. He called Maya's number. Her mother's phone. The real one. The one that existed before all of this. He got voicemail. It was late. She'd be asleep. He listened to her outgoing message twice. Then he said, "Hey baby, it's Dad. I know it's late. I just wanted to tell you I love you. You are the smartest person I know, and you are going to do things I can't even imagine. Don't let anybody tell you Fresno is the end of anything. It's just where you start." He paused. "I'm sorry I wasn't around more. That's on me. You deserve better than every other weekend." Another pause. "Don't look for shortcuts, Maya. The world is mostly fair if you let it be. I figured that out a little late, but I figured it out." He ended the call. He looked at the paper in his hand. The thing across from him tilted its head. Daniel read the seal out loud. Omar was on the porch when it happened. He described it later as a sound that wasn't quite a sound, more like a pressure drop, like the moment before your ears pop on a plane. The smell of ozone, sharp and total, and then gone completely. The air on the porch suddenly just air again. He went back inside. Daniel was gone. Christina was on the kitchen floor, conscious, disoriented, asking where she was. She had a gap. Weeks of nothing. She would spend months trying to understand what had happened to her and never fully would. She never remarried. She kept Daniel's photo on the mantle. She told Maya her father had loved her more than anything. She was not wrong. Maya Reyes is 22 years old now. She found out the shape of what happened through her mother and through an old man named Omar Khalil, who came to find her when she turned 18 and sat with her for 3 hours and told her as much of it as he could bear to tell. She plays the voicemail every year on his birthday. She has never deleted it. She told the person who submitted this story that she doesn't know exactly what her father did or exactly what he faced. She just knows he made a phone call first. Before anything else, he made sure she heard his voice. She said that's the part that gets her every time. Not the end, the phone call. That's the story. I don't know what to tell you about Jinn. I don't know what to tell you about what's older than us and what it wants. I know the literature is real and the tradition is ancient and the warnings inside it are consistent across 1,000 years and a dozen cultures. I know Daniel Reyes existed. I know he had a daughter who misses him. And I know that whatever is in that apartment on a street in Fresno, if anyone is still living there, I hope they don't notice the smell. Because if you can smell copper and ozone in a room where there's no reason for it, the door isn't all the way closed. Sleep well. I'll see you next time.